Hello, and welcome to Storytime with Uncle Gravy. So it's Friday, or it is when I'm recording this. So if you've just started right from the beginning and you're watching this on a Tuesday, then don't take too much into account what I just said. But anyway, I hope you're all well and smiley and staying safe and all that kind of stuff. And big hellos to Isaac and Theo and Joseph and all the regular viewers and listeners. If you're doing housework with me waffling on in the background, that's okay. You don't need to be looking, as long as you're hearing the story and hopefully enjoying it. So we're going to be picking up from where we left off yesterday, because that's how books generally work. And Ash and Darcy have been making discoveries about themselves and the things around them, and we're going to pick up from there. Both Ash and Darcy needed another few moments to take in what had happened and what had been planned. Darcy almost felt disappointed at not having a first hedgehog ride and going adventuring to the glowing path and the mystery hole, but was already looking forward to the excitement building up over the rest of the night and the next day. Ash felt like a rest, all of a sudden. Meeting Darcy had been a shock. Simply being with Darcy and soaking up all the energy produced by Darcy had been quite tiring, and now that there were plans to travel to new areas together on the back of hedgehogs, Ash's head was very full indeed. Although the moon was now very bright and the night was only just over half of the way done, it felt like an easy thing to follow Darcy to an area of shelter, which was a couple of old plastic pots with holes in their sides, and settle down for a much needed nap. Neither of them actually spoke that much on the way, but once they were lying down, the voices and thoughts of the evening were hard to shake. Over at the glowing hole, Bernie was still a safe distance away from it, and seemed happy just to be looking in, but Chris was sticking an ear through the gap and looking around the edge. The hole gave Chris a series of challenges to overcome. Firstly, it was usually Chris who had answers and ideas, but this space was unlike anything that had happened before, or had been heard being discussed by the giants, so there were no facts to share. It also felt like a huge amount of hope was being pinned on it, but it was based on nothing that they could describe, and neither Chris or Bernie knew what they were actually hoping for, other than seeing Ash again one day. Chris began to realise that the longer they stayed there, the harder it would be to answer any questions that Bernie might come up with. Bernie would expect Chris to see things, spot things, or work things out, and the pressure began to build and build inside Chris's fluffy head. After what felt like a long time, with Bernie hovering around and Chris looking more like a detective than a Rustle, Chris realised that time was needed so that disappointment could be avoided. "Bernie," said Chris very confidently and turning around from the hole's edge, "I think I may have spotted something which I need to see in the daylight. It could offer a clue as to what is happening both here and through the hole in the other land. It might be nothing, but I think it could be important. I don't want to say too much at the moment though, so let's go for now and agree that we will come back again tomorrow night." Bernie, of course, was interested by what Chris was saying and how it was being said, and was about to ask a question, but Chris carried on before there was a chance for it to turn into a chat. "I will visit here tomorrow in the daytime too, to check on my ideas, but I don't expect you to. It is too risky. There are obviously strange things happening here, so we should not take too many chances. Come on." Chris turned away from the hole and began to walk back the way that they had come earlier. Bernie felt weird. This hadn't been a chat. The last bit had just been an instruction. Bernie felt like this was the old Chris again, and wasn't sure that really felt that nice. But what Chris said had been said with such a clear voice and a seemingly clear mind that it meant Bernie looked one more time at the glowing land just centimetres away, and then turned and walked away, following Chris in silence. As they walked back to some shelter, Chris's head was far from silent. They just lied to Bernie, and that had not happened before, at least not deliberately. The reason Chris had lied? Just to gain some more time, to try and think of a reason for the glowing hole appearing, and to link it to Ash, somehow. Chris knew that this would be almost impossible to work out, but felt sure it would be impossible to come up with a story while Bernie was there. So had simply avoided the situation, taken Bernie out of the picture, and had taken a huge risk that no story would actually come. It had been a very eventful evening for all of the Russells though, and strangely, luckily, they had all just actually made the same plan for the next night. Right then, what are the plans for tonight? The full moon, the night of discovery, the night of the hedgehog? Hollie's dad was smiling and patting the side of the tent bag, which he had just got out from its special place and put on the kitchen table. Hollie chuckled, amused by his description of her holiday homework, but also liking the fact that he understood she was really interested in it all. She let her dad know the plan and sounded very organised as she looked at her lists. Well, we agreed we would go into the tent later this time. It's light until really late, so we thought we'd go down there at 9 o'clock, so we are there when it starts to get dark. That way we'll hear and see more animals and wildlife as it starts to come out for the night, and we will stay up as late as we can. The lights will be glowing, so it will be easier to see and we won't be so tired. That means we'll be more accurate with our recordings. Ah, spoken like a natural scientist. I like your planning, Hollie. How about me and Mum put up the tent for you later? We'll have a late supper tonight, then you and Jake can enter your garden lab with fuel in your tummy and your notepads ready for action. We'll turn the house lights off at midnight, so it'll get even darker for you then. Hollie agreed this was a good plan and went to her room to gather her notebook, pens, torch and important stuff. She also stopped to think about what she had recorded in her notebook at the last campout and, importantly, what she hadn't. Hollie was now nearly all organised and checked the forecast for the day. It was due to be dry and very warm all the way into the night. The television weather people took great pleasure in saying that it would be a muggy, sticky night, and Hollie was actually looking forward to being outdoors again. Being under the stars was always a treat, and usually only happened on holidays when the rules tended to melt as fast as the parents' ice cream and their drinks. It was an exciting thing to see her parents putting up the tent, and they joked around as they did it, reminding her that parents, or grown-ups, were still people too, sometimes. Down at the end of the garden, where poles were being laid out and ground sheets being stretched, Bernie and Chris were keeping a very low profile. These noises were familiar. They had heard the same clanging and metal and material flapping sound shortly before Ash disappeared, and it was making them feel a little uneasy. They had to be brave, though, and come out of their shells in case the giants came too close with their huge shoes and their heavy feet. Bernie and Chris both emerged at the same time, but didn't say anything to each other at first. Bernie pointed in the opposite direction to the noise, and Chris nodded, forcing a smile, but still feeling very unsure of what was going to happen that day and, more importantly, that night. They both reached other places to shelter, but only after a very patient hide-and-seek session with the cat, who kept seeing them and going into attack mode. Hollie's parents saw it several times, lying totally flat on the ground, then raising to its bottom and flapping its tail, coiling up and ready to leap. They didn't even think to try and wonder what it was seeing, but then a lot of grown-ups don't tend to think like that. Thankfully, it decided that day that it was far too hot for it to waste any energy running around or chewing on a fluffy thing. So after a few full starts, it crept away and curled up in its special grassy circle, below the taller sunflowers at the side of the garden. After a short nap, Bernie went over to where Chris had crawled to chat about the plan for the night, but Chris wasn't there. Bernie assumed that Chris had headed off to the hole and was sticking to the plan which had been delivered the previous night, and felt happy in a way that maybe something new would be discovered soon. The truth was that Chris had tried to have a nap, but was still whirling around things to say that night, and it had become clear that there were no solutions or big discoveries to actually share with Bernie. Walking far, far away from all the noise and fuss felt like the best way to try and get some peace. So Chris had lifted the shell and wriggled off through the grass, towards the side of the garden land that they didn't usually bother much with, as it was gravelly and full of flint and huge rocks. It was actually a rockery, built the previous year to try and attract common lizards. That had been another summer holiday project which Hollie had thrown herself into, with some good results. Chris went unnoticed and unseen for a long time, so had plenty of time to try and come up with a plan, but this actually made things feel worse. After a while, Chris decided that there would be no option other than to be brave and admit to Bernie that the whole thing was a mystery and that they were in the same position. Once this had been decided, the weight actually felt a little lighter. Bernie and Ash and Chris had known each other for all of their lives, however long that had actually been, and Chris felt that Bernie wouldn't be angry for long, even if the story was not to have a happy ending. While walking back towards the shelter for an afternoon nap, Chris did decide one more thing though. There wouldn't be a sudden admission of failure that night. No. Chris would still hope to see something, anything, that would give the chance to share some special and brilliant news with Bernie. Chris decided that by the time the house lights went dark, if nothing had happened that could help to create a story, then it would be time to admit defeat and tell the truth. Hollie and Jake spent some busy and shuffly time in the afternoon preparing the tent and getting everything just right. As before, they each had a small backpack which held a large notebook and a pen, a much smaller notebook which had tiny pages on a wire that flipped over, and an assortment of pencils. They both had a torch with spare batteries, just in case, and were planning to put other things in their backpacks too, but not until later that evening, when it wasn't so hot anymore. After all, having a midnight campout meant that you could also have a midnight feast, and they were not going to miss the chance to eat sweets and treats under a big, full moon. And so, the scene was set. The gardens were quiet, with the Russells all napping but dreaming about the night ahead. The hole, which it seemed only Hollie and Jake hadn't visited since it was cut out, was looking like it had always been there. The lights on Jake's side of the hole were now just cold silver poles, but were storing up energy for the night ahead too. The tent was up and only moved ever so slightly when a breeze drifted through the garden, but otherwise it looked ready for the evening plans. It was a good distance from the hole, so nothing would be afraid of coming through it. And this decision would turn out to be a very lucky one for everyone. And there's today's pause. So you now know that tomorrow we're going to hear about the campout. We're going to hear what happens during the campout, before the campout, and maybe even after the campout. And things are going to get very, very busy and very exciting very quickly. Thanks for watching today. Stay well. I hope you're all smiling, and I'll see you tomorrow.